They say every great crime begins with a question. But in this story, the question wasn't whispered in a dark alley or scribbled on a scrap of paper. It echoed through a cavernous warehouse deep in rural Quebec, where steel walls guarded one of the most valuable substances on Earth. The question was simple, bold, and mildly absurd. How much maple syrup could someone steal before anyone noticed? The answer, as the world would soon learn, was thousands of tons. Welcome to episode 3 of Dark Ledger, presented by eLearn College. Today, we unravel one of the most bizarre and daring heists ever committed. A crime so audacious, so quietly brilliant, and so unexpected that investigators didn't even realize they were dealing with a criminal empire at first. They thought something far more mundane had happened, perhaps a leak or an accounting mistake. But what they discovered shocked the nation. Before we dive in, make sure you subscribe to the channel so you never miss an episode of Dark Ledger. Stories like this don't come around often. And trust me, this one will grip you from the first stolen drop to the final courtroom reckoning. This is the Maple Shadow Job, the great Canadian maple syrup heist. The story begins not with explosions or sirens, but with the steady hum of an industrial heater warming a storage facility on the outskirts of Quebec. Here, among rows of metal barrels stacked like shimmering towers, lay the beating heart of the global maple syrup trade. Few people outside the industry understood its importance. Fewer still knew how fiercely the product was protected. But inside these walls rested more than syrup. It was security, stability, power. And over several quiet months in 2011 and 2012, that power began to disappear, one barrel at a time. At first, nothing seemed out of place. Workers would walk the aisles, check the barrels, note their positions. Everything looked normal, but that was part of the illusion. The thieves weren't smashing locks or sneaking in during the dead of night. They had access, permissions, familiarity. Their brilliance lay in their patience, and in their understanding that the greatest thefts aren't rushed, they're curated. Nearly 3,000 tons of syrup vanished before anyone realized what was happening. That was 77% of the world's supply. And the thieves accomplished it by siphoning syrup from barrel after barrel, replacing the golden liquid with water, resealing the containers, and slipping back into anonymity. It was, in every sense of the word, a masterpiece. To understand how this happened, you first need to understand the maple syrup world, a world governed not only by agriculture but by an organization with immense influence, the Federation of Quebec Maple Syrup Producers. To many, the Federation was a stabilizer. To others, a monopoly. But to the thieves, it was an opportunity. They knew that the Federation stored vast quantities of syrup as part of a global reserve, a strategic sweet stockpile. And they understood that this system, while strict, had a vulnerability. The barrels were weighed and tested periodically, but not constantly, and the sheer volume of the reserve meant that months could pass before an anomaly was noticed, and anomalies, as it turned out, were everywhere. Our story centers on a man named Richard, often described as charismatic, restless, and deeply frustrated with the Federation's tight control over maple syrup pricing. He was not a simple thief. He was a businessman, a smuggler, and in some ways a rebel. To some, he was a folk hero of free trade. To others, a criminal mastermind. His motivations were tangled with resentment, ambition, and a desire to outwit a system he believed was strangling producers' freedoms. But even masterminds need accomplices. The operation he built wasn't glamorous. It involved trucks, siphoning equipment, and hours of labor, but it required trust. Every barrel touched left a trace of risk. Every movement meant another pair of hands, another witness, another potential threat to the operation's secrecy. By the end, more than a dozen individuals were tied to the scheme. Yet for months, the Maple Shadow job went completely undetected. One of the earliest accomplices later described the experience as surreal. "We weren't just stealing syrup," he said. "We were stealing a piece of Quebec's identity." There was adrenaline, of course, but also a strange sense of righteousness. They saw themselves as liberators, breaking syrup free from what they perceived as an oppressive economic structure. They might have believed they were modern-day Robin Hoods, but the truth was more complicated. The breakthrough came not because of a tip or an informant, but because of a mistake. A warehouse worker climbing up a stack of barrels felt one shift beneath his foot, almost tipping over. Surprised, he steadied himself and took a closer look. The barrel looked normal, identical to the rest. But it was empty, or nearly so. When he opened it, he found water sloshing inside. At first, he thought someone had mislabeled it, but then he opened another, and another, and another. Water, water, water. There is a particular kind of silence that settles over a person when they realize they've been robbed without even noticing. Investigators were called. The doors were sealed. And what followed was one of the most meticulous audits in Canadian history. Barrel after barrel was tested. What the Federation discovered was staggering. Millions of liters of syrup had been silently siphoned away over months. The thieves had struck with precision, discipline, and astonishing patience. They had left just enough weight, just enough structure to fool anyone who didn't look too closely. But now the illusion had shattered. The investigation expanded rapidly. The Sûreté du Québec, the provincial police, took control. Officers mapped the warehouse, catalogued every barrel, traced vehicle movements, analyzed fingerprints, and followed the faint trails of sticky residue left behind at various locations. And then they made a discovery that changed everything. Black market syrup. Investigators began finding containers of maple syrup with serial numbers that should have been sealed in the reserve. They traced distribution routes, spoke with brokers, and realized that entire shipments had been sold to unsuspecting buyers who had no idea they were handling stolen goods. The syrup had traveled across provinces, even across borders. The thieves hadn't just stolen syrup, they had infiltrated the entire supply chain. The mastermind, Richard, became the focus. He denied everything. He called the Federation tyrannical. He cast himself as a victim of state overreach. But the evidence grew. Phone records, transport logs, hidden storage sites, a network of accomplices. The Maple Shadow job had begun as a slow, careful siphoning. But by the time the authorities closed in, the operation had grown into a full logistical enterprise, a criminal business with its own transport routes, handlers, and even negotiators. In one of the most dramatic moments of the investigation, police raided a warehouse and found barrels stacked 3 high, each filled with syrup that matched the missing reserve. It was a treasure trove of maple gold. And then came the arrests. They were called sticky-handed in the papers, a phrase that would go viral globally. Memes began circulating. Late-night hosts joked that only in Canada could the crime of the century involve pancakes, but beneath the humor lay a sophisticated, multi-million-dollar conspiracy. In 2013, several of the suspects stood trial. Some received fines, others received prison sentences. The mastermind's fate, however, remained the most dramatic. He was ordered to repay the full amount of the stolen syrup, $13.7 million, a staggering figure that reflected not only the value of the product, but the damage to trust, trade, and international supply. And years later, in 2022, Canada's Supreme Court upheld the decision. Pay it back in full, they ruled, or spend 6 more years behind bars. Justice, as the newspapers said, had never tasted sweeter. But how did Richard actually pull it off? How did the network operate without being detected? And what motivated such an unlikely crew to risk so much for syrup? The answers, and the deeper psychological twists, lie ahead. Let's take a look at what inside the heist, the planning, the betrayals, the internal tensions, and the unraveling that exposed the Maple Shadow job from the inside out. Continue to the next episode segment to learn how this extraordinary crime truly unfolded. What struck investigators most wasn't the volume of stolen syrup. It was the organization behind it. Because to pull off a heist worth over $13 million, the thieves had to behave less like opportunists and more like logisticians. And that's where the Maple Shadow job reveals its true depth. Inside the network, members described the early days as almost casual. A few barrels taken here and there, a quiet test, a poke at the system to see if it would react. When it didn't, the group grew bolder. What began as a simple idea turned into a months-long operation requiring trucks, manpower, storage sites, and coordination tight enough to avoid detection. The barrels were heavy, nearly 300 kilograms each when full. But the thieves had a plan. They rented a warehouse under the guise of a legitimate business and used it as a temporary refinery. Trucks would arrive loaded with barrels from the official reserve, and workers would siphon out the syrup, pumping it into unmarked containers that were transported to various black market buyers. Then came the sleight of hand, the replaced barrels. Filled with water to mimic the original weight, they were returned to the reserve with the same care one might give stolen artwork. But beneath this choreography, tensions simmered. As the operation expanded, so did the number of people involved. Each new participant increased the risk. Some were true believers, convinced that the Federation needed shaking up. Others were simply chasing profit, and a few were in over their heads, unsure of what they had joined until it was too late to turn back. Those close to Richard said he carried himself like a general. He spoke of fairness, freedom, and disrupting what he saw as a system that kept smaller producers trapped. In his mind, the heist was not a crime but a correction, a way to redistribute wealth and challenge what he viewed as unfair control. But behind his rhetoric lay undeniable ambition. The money was substantial, the influence was real, and the thrill was intoxicating. One accomplice recalled a night where the group celebrated quietly after moving a massive shipment without incident. They toasted with beer, sticky with syrup that had coated their gloves all day. "We felt unstoppable," the accomplice said, "like nobody could ever catch us." But criminal enterprises rarely fall all at once. They crumble from within. The moment that triggered the collapse came when two members of the network began arguing over payment. One claimed he had been underpaid for the grueling work. The other believed the operation was becoming too risky. Their dispute escalated until one threatened to quit, and quitting in a conspiracy of this size was dangerous. Word spread to Richard, who insisted that loyalty was paramount. But cracks had formed, and it was through those cracks that investigators would soon pry open the empire. When the first barrels of water were found at the reserve, the thieves had already moved a significant amount of syrup through the black market. But investigators weren't just interested in the barrels. They were tracing the money, the phone calls, the drivers. Every illicit product leaves a trail, even syrup. And so the net began to tighten. Authorities traced a truck driver to a warehouse he shouldn't have been near. Inside, they found syrup-laden barrels ready to be shipped. They seized documents, receipts, and records that tied back to the group. A ledger contained coded notes, but not coded well enough. In the end, the thieves weren't brought down by a dramatic shootout or a chase through snowy roads. They were undone by paperwork, by the very logistics that had once made them efficient. During the arrests, officers described walking into rooms that smelled unmistakably of maple. It was everywhere, one investigator said. On the floors, on the tools, on the equipment. It was like the walls themselves were telling the story. Richard fought the charges fiercely. He claimed the Federation was targeting him because he disagreed with its power. He argued he was a political prisoner of sorts. But the evidence was overwhelming. In court, prosecutors outlined the meticulous operation. Witnesses testified about barrels being rolled down ramps, loaded into trucks, and quietly driven away under the nose of a system never designed to expect a crime of this kind. They spoke of late-night siphonings and hidden containers stored in garages and fields. The judge listened, unimpressed by the justifications. The sentence was severe and intentionally so. Canada wanted to send a message, not just to the thieves, but to anyone considering exploiting the nation's most iconic export. Still, even after the convictions, one question lingered in the public imagination. Why maple syrup? Why risk prison, bankruptcy, and total ruin for something as gentle and as wholesome as syrup? It was almost poetic. The masterminds saw the syrup not as a breakfast topping, but as liquid gold, a valuable commodity tightly controlled by a powerful federation. They also understood the global demand. And perhaps in their minds, they believed they were striking a blow against a system they couldn't change legally. But there was something else too. Syrup is symbolic. In Canada, it represents tradition, pride, and authenticity. To steal it was to rebel not just against an institution, but against an identity. And that symbolism turned the heist from a mere crime into a cultural spectacle. The world didn't laugh at the idea of stolen syrup. It marveled at it. It was absurd and brilliant in equal measure, combining small-town familiarity with international consequences. And perhaps no other commodity could carry such a story without losing its strange charm. The aftermath was far-reaching. The Federation increased its security dramatically. The syrup reserve became something closer to a fortress. Cameras, alarms, and more frequent inspections became standard. Some producers, surprisingly, sympathized with the thieves, even if they didn't support the crime. They understood the frustration that had festered for years. Others felt betrayed, their livelihoods threatened by a heist that could have destabilized markets worldwide. And Richard? His fate became a cautionary tale. Even years after the trial, he remained entangled in legal obligations. In 2022, the Supreme Court ruled that he must repay the full $13.7 million or spend an additional 6 years in prison. A stark reminder that even if syrup flows freely, justice does not. In the end, the Maple Shadow job entered history as one of the most unusual, audacious, and intricately organized thefts of the modern era. A story of ambition, resentment, cleverness, and ultimately downfall. And as investigators boxed up the remaining barrels, sealing them for inspection, one officer reportedly joked, "Crime doesn't pay, but sometimes it pours." The Great Canadian Maple Syrup Heist remains a testament to the strange corners of human ingenuity. A reminder that even in the quietest industries, behind the most ordinary containers, extraordinary stories can unfold. This concludes Episode 3 of Dark Ledger, presented by eLearn College. If this story captivated you, make sure you subscribe, because the next episode dives into a world even more unexpected, and the secrets waiting there may change how you see history's quietest crimes. Until then, remember, even the sweetest crimes can leave a bitter aftertaste.